Hey everyone, my name is Anil, and in this video, we're going to learn how you can put together a very simple AI agent that can help you automate tasks fairly quickly, right? Now, the idea here is for this to be a pretty introductory kind of video into practically setting up AI agents. And then we'll have some interesting videos where we start making the examples more complicated. So in this video, we're going to pick a very simple example. We have an income expense classifier, right? What it does is, say you have some text, as you can see here, that says, I've spent so much money. What you have is an agent, and it's not an LLM, it's an AI agent powered by an LLM that then kind of classifies that, determines whether it's an income or an expense, and then using the tools it's provided, pushes it into an income table or an expense table. So fairly simple. You'll find that it's a single step or a single loop agent. It just has to complete one loop. But I think it's a good example to help you get started with AI agents. Now, let's start by just looking at a quick intro into what AI agents is. I'd like these kind of videos to be fairly practical because I find that that's the best way, at least for me, to learn. But let's kind of give you a basic outline. So the basic idea of an AI agent, and when we talk about AI agents today, they're basically LLM powered agents where LLMs handle the reasoning. The idea of an AI agent is a system that can solve a task autonomously. So what we mean by that is, say you have a task here, you give it to the agent, and the agent should respond to you with the solution without you having to intervene. And agents don't have to be these large, complex systems that run for hours. There are agents today that are capable of doing that are being developed. But they can also be just simple, systems that solve simple tasks. And when we talk about a task, at least for the context of what we're going to be doing today, we mean a data and a set of instructions on what the agent needs to do with that data. So as we're seeing, the agents, the simplest kind of, if you take away all the frills, the basic idea of an agent is it has an LLM which serves as the reasoner, right? So it kind of is the agent trying to understand what it needs to do given the instructions and the data. And then what agents have are called tools, which is how the agent acts. So it uses the tool to kind of do something, right? In our case, for example, update the table. And an agent is basically just, in its simplest form, just this, an LLM that decides what action needs to be taken, the tool that performs the action, and then reverts back to the LLM. Now, the LLM needs a way to judge or understand how this process or how these steps are being followed properly. And how it does that is, again, in a very simple way, using what is called the agent state. So each reasoning step the LLM goes through, it pushes that information into the state. Then the tool acts on what the LLM wants it to do and pushes that information back into the state. And then the LLM, when it starts reasoning, uses this information in the state to determine what the next step is, right? And this cycle continues. So in our case, for example, the LLM will say it's an income or an expense, call the corresponding tool. And then depending on what the tool responds with, the state is updated with that. Say in our case, push to expense or push to income, and the LLM goes ahead and says, okay, I've done my job. And the agent realizes that it's done its job and it exits. So this is the basic orchestration of this agent. The same architecture can be used for much more complex tasks as well, where it's just more tools and more loops, right? Where the LLM just keeps iterating till the task is done. Now, what we're going to do here, as I said, is keep it very simple. And in the next video and from there on, we'll add components like memory, explore more complex tool interactions like using MCP, and so on. You could add a planner, and so on. Now, in our case, income expense classifier, you have the reasoner, which in our case is going to be a GPT model. We're going to use the OpenAI API. We've got a wrapper built around it, which I'll give you. And we're going to use that as a reasoner. And then the tools are just functional tools. So in our case, the simple Python functions update income, update expense, that will update the corresponding table. That's it. Very simple, right? Now, to get you started, and if you've seen some of our previous videos, we've been talking about this framework, which is a small Python framework or tool we've put together to help us work or experiment with AI workflows and AI agents. So Laeyerz is kind of the name of the framework. It's available on Git. It's open source in Python. And we have a simple version 1 agent that we've put together where, which looks something like this. So this is basically the all you need to set up the agent, where you have the agent initialization. What you need to pass it is a reasoner, which is an LLM model, written in a certain format, which again will give you the LLM. So I'll give you the LLM model. The focus of this video is not that. What you need to give it is the instructions, and that helps you initialize the agent along with a description of the role, right? You add the tools to the agent, and adding tool is basically giving it a name, a description, and then describing what the inputs to the tool are, describing any outputs if there are. In this case, the tool just updates the database and that's it. And then what the function, these are functional, at the moment these are just functional tools, so it's just a Python function that does something. So it's a very elementary agent and very good to help you get started, right? No complexities. And then as we do more complex examples, we'll start adding complexities to this. And getting this framework, if you haven't tried out some of our previous examples, then it's on GitHub, right? Pixigen.layers, and it's open source. You can just go and git clone it. Not yet available on pip, hopefully soon. But just go clone this repository, cd into the repository, and do pip install -e dot. You should be up and running. It has minimal dependencies. And like I said, the OpenAI connector, I'll give you as part of this example in the code, so you don't have to go ahead and do that. But for that, you need to install in OpenAI. It's Python, wrapper, but that's about it. Okay, so hopefully this is kind of already making you feel this isn't too complicated, and you've got an idea of what we're setting up. Now let's quickly go into Python and run an agent in a few minutes. Okay, so let's get coding now, right? Now, this should take only a few minutes because it's a fairly easy to understand example, hopefully. Now, to install Laeyerz, what you can do is just go clone this repository, git clone, https://github.com/pixigen/layers.git. Once you do that, cd into Laeyerz and pip install -e dot. Minimal dependencies, should be pretty quick, right? And if you are getting confused or want a little more help in terms of setting this up and other examples, just go. We have the documentation up at layers.com, so you can go ahead and check that out, right? Now, what do we need to set up our agent? So layers.agent, that's the subfolder. .agent, you just import agent. What we're also going to do is import key manager. What key manager is a simple utility that just helps us manage API keys, right? And so those are the two imports you're going to need for this. Again, pretty straightforward. Now, what do we need? We need a simple function that serves as our expense manager. Now, expense manager, we're not going to do anything fancy and push to databases. This is a very elementary example, right? So getting started example. So we've written a very simple class in Python. It's got two lists, basically. One is income, one is expense, into which you're going to push these objects, right? Which is basically going to have an amount and a title, and that's it. So we're not trying to do anything fancy here. It's just getting you started. And so that's the expense manager. So let's just run this. You run the imports. Once you've installed Laeyerz, you should get this. And again, even agent it's just the loop is done internally. There is no complex dependency there. So I've instantiated expense manager. This is basically going to serve as a tool, right? And basically each function is going to serve as a tool. So we've got two tools, add income and add expense. Now what do we need? Now what we need to do, what we need the API keys for are the LLM, right? The LLM is forming the brain of our agent. And so what we need to do is I'm just going to import key manager, which we'd imported above. I'm just going to set it up, say key manager, and pass the env file. Now, the way key manager works in Laeyerz, if you just don't pass in anything, it's just going to look for a .env, not a .env.json. It's going to look for a .env in the same folder. In this case, I haven't done that. I've got an env.json, in a different folder. I've just set the path to that, and the key manager will go in and load the API keys from that. I've stored the OpenAI API key with this tag, right? And so that's all I need, right? And if you are a little unfamiliar with env files, I'll add a link to a small short where we'll just give you a quick intro to API keys. So now that we've got our OpenAI API key, which you get from the OpenAI website, you register for it and they'll give you an API key. And then we're going to set it up. Now we're going to use, first thing, we need to import, a wrapper that we've written, right, to help you call the OpenAI node, because the Laeyerz agent requires a certain function or a certain call format. Now I'm importing this from this, again, it's a Git repository where we put all our connectors that we set up for Laeyerz. You can go ahead and clone that repository if you want, but I'm also actually going to provide you with um, that code. So it's going to look something like this. It's basically dependent on the Python OpenAI library or client, and what it does is it's built on Laeyerz' concept of nodes, which is basically the pieces of the workflow, of a workflow. And so it just inherits that. It sets up a node that can be used directly in a workflow. But as you can see, it's just a simple wrapper around. In this case, I'm using the chat API. You can use the responses API as well if you want. So I'll provide this as well in the link here with the where the code is. So you can just import it directly. And then we'll set it up. We're going to use a very, simple LLM model. You don't need anything fancy. So this is very low cost. And you just instantiate this. So we've imported the OpenAI node as LLM. I'm just going to pass it. What you have to do with nodes and Laeyerz is pass in the name and a config dictionary, which in this case has the API key and the model. And that's it. If you're not familiar, you don't have to worry about this. Just import this. If you're more interested in how nodes work in Laeyerz, I'll add links to some of our previous videos where we have actually built workflows in Laeyerz, right? So that'll give you an idea. It's basically a wrapper again, but using a certain format so it can be used, when you set up workflows. Okay, now what do we need to do? So to run the agent, we've set up our reasoner, which is the LLM, and this has to be passed to the agent. What we also need is to define for the agent a role and instructions. So what's the role? It's an expense classifier. Actually, I'm going to say an income expense classifier. And what are the instructions? So the role is actually very simple, just to give the agent a quick kind of intro, or rather the LLM, which serves as the brain of the agent, the reasoner, a quick intro to what it's supposed to do, what its task is, and then rather what its role is. Now the instructions, and you've probably heard of skills and things like that. They are more complex versions of these instructions. This is a very simple example. So all you need is a simple set of instructions. Be very precise. You're telling the LLM, you'll be given a message. You need to classify it into income or expense. And then depending on that, use the income, add income or add expense tool to update the expense manager. And then you're giving it the tool. So in this case, the agent interface we have set up figures out, that these are tools, especially because you have to add the tools. It figures that out, and then it uses the relevant tools API, if it's OpenAI and so on, to kind of do the relevant logic, which we'll not go through now. We'll have a video in the future where we'll actually build one from scratch in Python. So you have your role and the instructions, right? And so we have all we need to set up the agent. So let's go set up the agent. Pretty straightforward. And actually in the, on the Laeyerz docs, I have an example for this. So again, you can just go check that out. But again, agent is also a node in Laeyerz, just a point, because in the future we'll be building agentic workflows where an agent is just a part of a workflow, right? So you have an agent, you give it a name. I'm calling it an income expense classifier. And then, in the config, you specify what the reasoner is. So you pass in this reasoner LLM, you pass in the role, you pass in the instructions. I'm going to leave the tool dictionary empty for now. Okay, so next we're going to add tools, and as I'd shown you before in the theory part, it's a very simple function, of this agent class. You have to pass in the name, a description to what this function is doing. It's actually quite similar if you've used the OpenAI tools call, because what it has to do is, depending on the LLM you're calling, use this and translate it to that, right? So you pass in the name of the variable, In this case, I'm calling it string. Actually, you can call it number as well if you want. Um, doesn't matter, but actually for now, I'm just going to stick to string, right? Because we're not doing any math with this, but I'm just showing you can do that. And what it does, it tells you the amount of the transaction, and in this case, it tells you a description of the transaction. These functions, they don't return anything, so there's no output. And then you pass in the actual function. So expense manager, which we've set up there, dot add income. And that's it. The agent has got its tool. In this case, and at the moment, the Laeyerz agent just takes in functional tools. Now, as we cover more interesting topics, you'll start seeing how we can use, and I'll keep updating, more recent releases where you'll start seeing, more complex tools, MCP connections, and so on. But even with function calls, there actually it solves most of our examples because you can have a function and it does what you want it to do, connect to an API and so on. The other tool is add expense, adds the expense, and it's again same amount and title. So it's a very simple example. The tools are very similar, and our agent is actually set up, right? That's all we need. So now what do we do? We are ready to run the agent. So what do we say? We say outputs, which is what the outputs are going to be assigned to, is agent.run agent, and you pass in a dictionary with the inputs, right? So the input is, I'm going to call it transaction, spent rupees 500 on apples. This is going to get passed in. This is actually task, and this is going to get passed in to the agent reasoner, which is going to take this, do the relevant actions, and return the output. And that's it. So let's run this. You can see it runs this. The task is transaction this. We've already given it the instructions. It knows what the functions are. So step one, reasoning, it goes in and it'll say, okay, in this case, we don't have a separate LLM for classification. It just says it's a purchase because it's spent rupees 100. It'll call the add expense amount. That's the reasoning of the LLM, telling you what it's supposed to do, which function it's calling, what the arguments are. And then goes and calls the tool. The tool doesn't return anything, goes back to the reasoner and says, okay, what now? It says it's recorded the expense. And so the agent's final response is to you, to the user, it's reported the expense. And that's what you're going to see. So if you hit outputs, you see that it's returned the output, which is, what it is. It's recorded this, and we have it also. So it gives you what it's done. It gives you a small summary called key points, what it did. So that's how agents in Laeyerz works. It gives you a task key point, which tells you determine the transaction is an expense and prepare to do it, so on and so forth. And it also returns the steps that it did. So you can play around with this and you can extract this and you can see what the agent actually did, right? Which will give you a better understanding. And if I go and hit expense manager or income, it did nothing because it was not an income. If I hit dot expense, you see that it has been updated. Want to try another example? I say earn rupees 200 as dividend. It runs the agent again. Again, it's, telling you what the tools are and so on. Now it's running the reasoner. And then as we'll see pretty quickly, it says it's added to income. And if I'm not reviewing this because the output it gives you is, slightly more complex. You can just check the expense manager dot income and the expense manager dot expense. And you'll see in a second that, the corresponding entries have been updated. So in this case, income now has got dividend as well. Expense has not been updated. And so that's that, right? We've set up a very simple agent that helps us at the moment classify. Now, as you've seen, it's just one loop, right? There's a reasoning step, there's the tool response, there's the completion. So it's the start of the second reasoning. It realizes the task is done and it exits. So hopefully this is kind of, taking away any fear if you've had any about how complex agents can be. They're actually quite simple. And now in the next video, we're going to explore a slightly more complex task, which is going to require a little more looping, a few more steps, a little more thinking from the reasoning agent, in this case, the LLM. So hopefully this is helpful. It helps you get started with agents, and hopefully you will also find Laeyerz useful as a good starting point to get going with workflows, and in our case with AI agents. So see you on the next one.